As one of our top-rated speakers from 2015, we welcome back Sheila Heen. In addition to lecturing at the Harvard Law School, Sheila has spent the last 20 years with the Harvard Negotiation Project, developing negotiation theory and practice. She specializes in particularly difficult negotiations, where emotions run high and relationships become strained. Sheila works with executive teams to strengthen working relationships, work through tough conversations, and make sound decisions together. She's co-author of the New York Times business bestsellers Difficult Conversations: How to Discuss What Matters Most. And thanks for the feedback, the science and art of receiving feedback well. Let's welcome Sheila Heen back to the summit stage.
You know those on-again, off-again relationships? You know, where people break up, but then they get back together, and then they break up again, you know, definitely for good this time. And then they get back together to give it one more try. Yeah, I had friends in high school and college who were in relationships like that, and I swore I was never gonna do that. So then I did. I was in law school, and I think I knew from the very beginning that this was not the right relationship for me. There was just an absence of kindness or maybe compassion at the heart of it. And yet, I kept getting talked back into giving it one more try. And during that confusing and painful time, I wondered, why was I having such a hard time with this? I mean, I was a negotiation person already. Why was I having such a hard time negotiating myself out of this relationship? And to be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I started working on understanding particularly difficult conversations. What makes them so hard, why we get stuck, and what helps. And alongside my colleagues Doug Stone and Bruce Patton, we spent 7 years writing the book that would become Difficult Conversations. And during that long journey, one of the things that sustained me, kept my spirits up, was the idea that someday we would figure this out and we would finish this thing, and somebody would publish it, and then they would send us on one of those book tours, right? And the particular image I had was of the hometown book reading, right? Big auditorium, standing room only, everybody cheering. Are you learning a little too much about my fantasy life here? Yeah, fair enough. So anyway, we did eventually finish it, and Viking Penguin published it, and indeed, they sent us on a book tour. Now, we did some really cool stuff on that tour. We spoke at the Smithsonian, we went on Oprah, but I was particularly looking forward to the hometown reading, which happened to be scheduled at the very end of the tour, so I was looking forward to it for weeks. Now, on the night in question, we show up at the venue. The publisher has rented out a big auditorium just like my fantasy, and there are 18 people there. 11 of whom are related to us. Now, one of the people who came, by the way, was my co-author Doug Stone's sister, Roberta, and she brought her 3 kids. So Andrew was about 7 at the time, Charlie was 5, Caroline was 1. I'm counting the 3 kids and the 18, yeah. So we launch into our talk, and about halfway through, Caroline, the 1-year-old, gets a little fidgety. Robbie doesn't want to disturb the other, 10 people there. So she gathers up the kids, and she slips out the side door. Now, the door is closing, but it's not quite closed. And we hear Charlie, the 5-year-old, who looks up at his mother and says, "Mom, that stunk." Now, luckily for us, Andrew, the wiser older brother, sort of leapt to our defense. And he looks at Charlie and goes, "Charlie, it was supposed to stink." Now, that experience has stuck with me because, first of all, it was traumatizing, of course. And I should remind you, if you want to comment on this session, please wait until the doors close behind you. Yeah, but that experience has also stuck with me because it reminds me of how we often feel about the difficult conversations in our lives. that somehow they're not supposed to stink. I don't know, if I were smarter or more confident or more assertive or had a thicker skin or, that other person had a personality transplant, these conversations wouldn't be so hard. But I'm here to tell you that every one of us on this planet has difficult conversations in our lives. If you work with other people, if you live with other people, if you happen to be in a country with other people, wherever you are in the world, you have difficult conversations. They are simply part of being human and being in relationship together. And they are certainly a big part of leadership. In many ways, your job as a leader is to have these conversations. Typically, as you become more senior in any organization, you spend more and more of your time having these conversations. And how you handle those conversations day in and day out defines your leadership. All right, here's the bad news. There's a way in which they're kind of supposed to stink. To the extent that you have difficult conversations in your life as a leader, it tells me two things about you. It tells me that, number one, you care a lot about what you are doing. You are invested in doing it right and having the biggest impact you can. And number two, it tells me you care a lot about the people you're doing it with. That you hesitate to jeopardize those relationships, and you certainly don't want to make things worse. So I want to invite you to think about the difficult conversations in your life. Raise your hand if you can think of at least one stressful situation, relationship with friction, etc., in your life right now. At the sites as well. Look around, because you're in good company. And I think that every team and every family has at least one person who's difficult, right? That everybody finds difficult. If you can't think of who that is, it's you. Yeah. Yeah. So we asked many of you, tell us, what are the hard conversations that you face as a leader? And in addition to the usual topics, talking about money, making really hard decisions about strategy, or whether to fire someone, or to take the risk and jump, here were some of the other themes that I thought were particularly interesting and quite strong in your answers. So, finally, standing up for myself, saying no, and disappointing someone. Working across cultures, and by the way, across functions inside my organization, because every function has its own culture, right? And conflict between functions is incredibly common. Talking up, particularly telling your boss that they're wrong. And how about helping out your coworkers with their so-called self-awareness? These sound familiar? So what I want to do is I want you to be thinking about a real conversation in your life as we talk, because I want you to be thinking about what might I be able to use here? What new insights might I get in my own life? So I want to invite you to take out a piece of paper, open your notebook to that blank page. Write that person's name at the top of the page, the person you were thinking of. If they're sitting next to you, be sure to use a pseudonym. Or at least peek and see if they're writing you down. Yeah. You got it? All right, we're in this together. Here's where we're going to start. The most important thing to understand about understanding these conversations is that we have to look beyond what we're actually saying to each other. The problem just goes deeper than that. We have to look at what we're really thinking and feeling, and often not saying to each other. We have to look at what's in our internal voice. Now, you all have an internal voice, right? It does running commentary on your life. Just tune into it right now for a second. Find it. You might be thinking, that's kind of interesting. Some of you, it might be thinking, is she really wearing the same blue sweater that she wore last time she was here? Yes. I am. Uh-huh. It's a great sweater, you guys. And a few of you might be thinking, yeah, I don't know what she's talking about because I don't have an internal voice. That would be your internal voice, okay? So you found it. You found it. Congratulations. So listen, difficult conversations are exactly when our internal voice is turned up to full volume. It's incredibly busy. It's got loud reactions. And one of the things to learn about the internal voice is what it's busy doing during these conversations. And I want to take a closer look at that by actually using a real situation. So I'm going to introduce you to someone I met a few years ago who I'm going to call Monisha. Now, you know those firms that do like corporate training, team building events, scavenger hunts, exercises around collaboration? So Monisha and her friend Paul founded one of these firms, and the business has really taken off. However, Monisha is also starting to realize that good friends don't necessarily make good business partners. Now, don't get me wrong, Paul is incredibly creative and energetic and hardworking and innovative and talented. He just doesn't seem to understand the concept of a budget. And they have yet to turn a profit. And they sometimes have trouble paying the bills. And the other thing about Paul is he doesn't seem to understand that being partners means making decisions together. Now, just to make this more fun, I'm going to give you X-ray vision. So I'm going to give you the ability to see and listen in on what their internal voices are actually thinking and feeling during this conversation, but not necessarily saying to each other. So here we have Monisha's internal voice. Oh, and here's Paul.
Yes.
Oh, and Paul's internal voice.
Well, this is such an amazing idea. Thank goodness I found these guys. They're gonna save the project. Yeah. Oh, Monisha, hey, do you have a sec?
No. Sure, what's up?
Okay, so, hold on. Okay, get ready. Okay, so I just talked to this team building outfit out of Indiana. They bring in real race cars and have the executives work as the pit crew, changing tires, working against the clock to learn collaboration. They are available next month. They're gonna join us in Richmond.
Whoa, what? Wait, Paul, we don't have the budget to add anything to this, and we're what, shipping race cars to Richmond? Come on.
Get it? Look, if we want to land this client, we have to wow them.
Paul,
their first experience has to be...
We are 30 days outside of the deadline. We've really got to lock things down.
Yeah, have you lost your mind? We can't afford this. Paul,
I don't
why?
think we can't cover the costs as it is.
No vision, no imagination. Did you spend kindergarten doing spreadsheets? With your little pack of crayons?
Monisha, you know our current plan does not have a meaningful experience around collaboration, which our clients specifically asked for. It's race cars.
You know I'm right about this.
I don't care if it's race horses.
Well, they already moved everything around to be there. Don't worry, we'll make it work. And I'll see what we can do about budget.
Oh, great. We're gonna go bankrupt so you can fulfill your little teenage race car fantasy? Well, I wanted to be an astronaut. Oh, should we have our next client event on the moon? Oh!
How'd that go? Does it feel familiar? Do any of you have singing internal voices, by the way? So I certainly wish I did. So what can we learn from this? The first thing that you will start to notice as you listen to people's internal voices is that people's internal voices are preoccupied with very predictable things during these conversations. It does not matter who you're talking to. It does not matter what you're talking about. Your internal voice is busy with the same kinds of things every time. And what this means is that although on the surface these seem like a complicated mess, in fact, every difficult conversation has the same underlying structure. And if you learn that structure, it gives you landmarks to navigate yourself and the other person to the other side of any conversation in your life. So, what is that structure? To take a look at it, I want to talk to the real Monisha, her internal voice. Now, every conversation has the same internal structure. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on 3 pieces of that puzzle. And the place we're going to start is in our heads. The story we tell about what happened, what has happened, what is happening now, and what should happen in the future. And that story is driven by a handful of key questions. And the first is, who's right? And in particular, what am I right about? Because in the midst of all this uncertainty, what I'm pretty sure I'm right about is what feels safe. It's what I feel like I can defend. So, Monisha, what would you say you're right about in this situation?
Well, Paul should have consulted me before racing off to ship race cars.
Fair enough.
And I'm right about the budget numbers just not adding up. And I am definitely right about going bankrupt being a problem.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, by the way, notice how quickly we start to get into blame. The second question we want to know is, whose fault is it? Who screwed up? Who dropped the ball? Who is causing us to go over budget?
Oh, obviously, it's Paul's fault.
Clearly, right? So we want to know, when things go wrong, we want to know whose fault it is, because that tells us what the problem is, or maybe we should say who the problem is here. Now, there's one last question that makes up our story, which is, why is the other person acting this way? What is motivating them? What are their intentions? Why are they being so difficult? What do you think here?
Well, I can't figure out if Paul is irresponsible or just clueless. He doesn't seem to get that we can't operate at a loss just to keep the clients happy. I mean, money does not grow on trees.
I know. I learned that from my father. Did you learn that from your father?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's right over here. He's very happy about that.
Yeah. And I'm wondering where Paul's dad is.
Oh, nice point. Good question. Good question. So, by the way, the more frustrated we are with the other person, the more likely we are to tell a particularly negative story, to assume the worst about what is wrong with them. Now, those 3 questions drive the story we're telling in our heads. That's maybe the most obvious piece of the puzzle. But beneath that, there are 2 more things going on. By the time a conversation gets difficult, typically one and often both parties have strong feelings involved. Now, Monisha, you don't ever say, your external voice anyway, never says, I feel frustrated, but it certainly seems like you're surprised and alarmed and a little exasperated. Does that seem right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also feel ignored and frankly dismissed.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, honestly, I'm worried about the project succeeding too. And I'm well aware that Paul's out-of-the-box crazy ideas have really saved the day in the past. So I'm confused.
Yeah, fair enough. So difficult conversations often put a bundle of complicated and seemingly conflicting feelings on our plates. As we talk, by the way, write down 2 or 3 or 10 feelings you are having in the conversation that you are thinking about. And don't forget what the other person is feeling as well. Now, those strong feelings create a little bit of a dilemma for us, because at least in North America, I think we're really not supposed to be bringing our feelings to work, right? When you arrive, you're supposed to check your feelings at the door with security so that you can proceed through your day, be rational and professional and task-oriented. At the end of the day, you can pick your feelings up on the way out and take them home for your spouse to enjoy. But we're really not supposed to be having them at work. Did you get that memo? So, do feelings matter at work? Should they? Whether they should or not, they clearly do. As human beings, we cannot leave our feelings behind. So instead, we sit in meetings, on conference calls, read our email, and we have emotional reactions to what's happening, and we're supposed to pretend that they're not there. So they leak out through our tone of voice and our body language and that curt response to the email, and they fuel the conflict between us. And here's the rub. By the time something becomes a difficult conversation, usually we've got 2 problems. We've got the surface problem, the business problem. Are we going to have race cars or not? But underneath that is a deeper problem, which is how we each feel treated by the other. And if we don't talk about how we are each feeling treated by the other, we may solve the surface problem, but that deeper problem is going to come up in another form next week. All right, at the deepest level is what we call identity. Identity is the story we tell about who we are and what this situation suggests about us. If it feels difficult, chances are there's something the situation suggests about you that feels like it's at stake. Am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of love or respect? What do you think here, Monisha? What's going on for you here?
I can't believe I've let things get this far. I mean, why don't I stick up for myself? And why is it that Paul doesn't listen or even take my concerns seriously? He doesn't even seem to think he needs to consult me. I'm starting to wonder if he even respects me.
Yeah, fair enough. So this is part of what drives our strong feelings and colors our story about what happened. So by the way, think about other situations. Why is it so hard to talk about money? Well, maybe you're feeling undervalued and you don't want to be the kind of person who lets themselves be taken advantage of. But if you bring it up, will you look greedy? Will you look like the kind of person who cares more about money than mission? And in that on-again, off-again relationship for me, I think what I was struggling most with was what the situation suggested about me. Was I being fair to him and giving it a fair shot? Was I being forgiving enough? And was I a good person for hurting him so much? Thank you, Monisha, for being so honest with us.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit with myself. If you'll excuse me, I have a lot of thinking to do.
All right, so identity gets tripped, you can feel it in your gut, it fuels your strong feelings and reactions, and then it colors our story about what happened. And part of the trouble with this is if this is what's in our internal voice, well then it seems obvious that our job in the conversation is to explain to them why we are right, to set them straight so they finally get it. It also, I'm not going to blame them explicitly because I'm too nice for that, but it will be clear by the end of this conversation that the real issue is that they need to be fixed. They need to change, then we will not have a problem. Is it any wonder that people don't respond well to this? That these conversations don't go well? I mean, oddly enough, people don't respond well to being lectured and blamed and fixed. I don't know why. And so, in fact, we do hurt the relationship, and we do sometimes make it worse. Because what is invisible to us in the moment, but no less real, is that the other person also has an internal voice. And their internal voice is focused on what they are right about. Is Paul right about anything here? Well, sure. For him, this conversation isn't even about money. It's about saving the project, responding to the client needs, making sure it's a success. And he knows these race cars are a great idea. And he also knows that friends are supposed to trust each other. And if Monisha can't get that, if she puts the kibosh on these race cars and this client isn't happy, it's going to be her fault.
Definitely her fault.
He's trying to explain this to her. From his perspective, she's the one who doesn't get it, who isn't listening. So let's just pause and notice. These two are not just stuck. They are in two different conversations about two different topics, talking past each other. Here we have two topics, two talkers, and 0 listeners. All right, so what do we do about all of this? The key thing to do is first to change the story you're telling in your head. Change those 3 questions. And this is what helps me to actually align my story more closely with reality. So instead of asking myself, who's right or what am I right about, I ask, what is it that we both think this conversation is about? What do we both think this conversation is about? Think about your own conversation. What do you think you each think it's about? If you could figure that out, you can start to get curious about why we see this so differently. Why is it about that for you and this for me? And you can start to actually get curious about that. Do these two see this differently? What do you think? I don't know, someone pointed out to me recently, they both want to put it in their mouth, so I don't know. Maybe they're not so far apart. Yeah. Question number 2, rather than asking whose fault is it, ask what have we each contributed to this problem? What have we each done or failed to do that got us here? Now, what's the difference between blame and joint contribution? Let me be clear, because sometimes what we do is we say, well, I know I'm not supposed to blame people, but of course, we have to talk about what happened, right? So we say crazy things like, look, I'm not saying it's anybody's fault. But Leroy, if you could not screw that up next time, that'd be really helpful. Yeah, so what is the difference? Well, number 1, blame tends to look for who is most at fault, who was the key person. So that they're, in the doghouse, they have to fix it, they have reputational damage, et cetera. It could be a group, like that function over there. They're the ones who screwed this up, right? Joint contribution assumes everybody involved had some role to play. We each did or failed to do things that got us to where we are at today. And the second distinction is that blame tends to assume that somebody did something wrong. They didn't do their job. They acted unwisely or unprofessionally or inappropriately. Contribution actually includes things that might have been completely reasonable things to do. They just didn't help, right? So, and by the way, contribution isn't necessarily 50-50. It could be 90-10, and it often extends beyond you and me in the conversation. There are other players here who contributed to this. In this situation, the client's expectations have shifted. And maybe Monisha and Paul have been in business long enough to know how to deal with scope creep. They'll learn eventually, we hope. Right? So the client is playing a role here too. Now, what has Monisha contributed? Part of what she's contributed, it's not that she's done anything wrong, but when she saw that first budget, she knew it was tight at best, and at worst, totally unrealistic, but she didn't say anything because Paul had such good rapport with the client. And she's been tracking the numbers. She's even sent those spreadsheets to Paul, but she hasn't insisted that they sit down and talk about them. Now, hasn't Paul contributed to? Absolutely he has. So let's start with the fact that he doesn't read Monisha's emails. Do you have people in your organization like this? Yeah, drive you crazy, right? He definitely doesn't look at the attachments, that is for sure. Now, in his defense, he has good intentions, and that's the last piece of our puzzle, which is to change from why are they acting this way to instead separate intention from impact, recognizing that other people's intentions are invisible to us. We want to know why they're acting this way, but we cannot know. And the point here is not to assume everybody always has positive intentions. They may or may not. But even if they do have positive intentions, they're often having a bad impact. Here, I think Paul does want to do right by the client. He wants this to be a success. And yet, by running off to ship race cars without consulting, he is harming and undermining his relationship with Monisha, the project, and possibly the partnership. So, thinking about how do I separate whatever their intentions are and instead speak to the impact that I am worried about. That will actually help me have a better conversation. Now, what if, let's just step back and think, in your situation, what if we could stop arguing about who's right and instead work to understand why we see it so differently? What if we could stop wasting time on blame and instead look at joint contribution and to hold each other accountable? Because, by the way, joint contribution is the fuel for learning. When we've been talking about learning from mistakes, joint contribution is what takes us from here. Oh, I wonder what I'm doing that is contributing to this. Oh, maybe I should go over here. That's where learning comes from. That is the engine for that learning. And what if Monisha could give Paul the benefit of the doubt about his intentions, but be really clear about the impact she is worried about, both on their working relationship and on the budget? Now, what would happen? If she could do that, a couple of things would happen. Number one, her purpose in the conversation starts to shift, because it's no longer telling him and persuading him that she's right. It's instead asking and exploring and trying to understand. And number two, she could actually just be much more transparent about what she's actually thinking and feeling in what she's saying. And that transparency increases the power of her conversation, because she is authentically herself and she is actually open to influence. If you want to influence other people, the most powerful thing you can do is to be more open to influence yourself, the possibility that I might learn something new that will help me understand what in the world is going wrong between us, right? So you could just be transparent about what you are thinking and feeling. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of days about the difference between talking at and talking to. And I want to suggest that this takes us one step further to talking with. What would that sound like in practice? Well, it might sound a little bit like this. Let's assume that Monisha has done a little bit of this work thinking about her relationship with Paul. And then even when Paul comes in and surprises her being his usual exasperating self, she might be able to respond differently.
Monisha, hey, there you are. I just talked to this race builder, I'm sorry, oh my God. I talked to this team building outfit out of Indiana, and they bring in real race cars and have the executives work as the pit crew. They're gonna join us in Richmond.
Wow, okay, that's thinking outside the box for sure, Paul. It sounds like it could be amazing. My other reaction, though, Paul, is panic about what something new means for the budget. Look, I should have come to talk to you with this earlier, but we're running really close to the red already.
Look, if we want to land this client, we have to wow them. Their first is...
I'm actually not disagreeing with you, Paul, and I know you're working incredibly hard to make all this happen. But before we move forward, I want to be sure that you and I have thought that through together and decided on what makes sense. And you know, Paul, it's not just on this project. I think we've fallen into these roles where I'm the only one watching the money and you're the only one worrying about the client experience. And it feels like that is making us work at cross purposes with each other sometimes, and then we get frustrated with each other. I'd love to talk about that.
What do you think? Would this make a difference? So notice, by the way, that Monisha's not giving in, but she's also not just pushing back. She's holding both of their concerns as possible and important to talk about. And she also has to be persistent, because he doesn't get it the first time. He's still talking about whether this is a good idea when she's actually trying to acknowledge there's actually a second topic on the table. So it's not about having one magic phrase that is going to change everything. The good news and the bad news is that most difficult conversations are not one-shot deals. They are ongoing conversations where we start to change how we respond and how we handle those conversations, work to stay curious, be willing to be accountable, and to hold each other accountable while we try to understand what's going on together. So, what if you could do that in your life? What if you could do that in the relationship that you are thinking about? And while we're at it, what if we stopped holding our own identity as so either or? Like I'm either a good person or a bad person, a saint or a sinner. What if we could see ourselves more like God sees us, as fallible, but also worthy of love, as human beings who need each other, who sometimes misunderstand each other and disappoint each other and let each other down, but also who need each other in order to learn from those mistakes, find healing, make better decisions, and create a future together. Does this guarantee that these two are going to work this out? No. But it makes it more likely that they won't stay stuck, feeling indignant and blaming each other and waiting for the other person to change. What would happen in your life if you could do that? A number of years ago, researchers took students one by one, and they told each student, you're going to give a talk, starts in 5 minutes, it's in that building over there across campus. And on the pathway between the two buildings, the researchers planted someone designed to look like they were in distress. They needed medical attention. They were on the ground. They got rid of all the bystanders, and what they wanted to know was what percentage of people would stop to help. All right, based on your life experience, wherever you are in the world, turn to your partner. Turn to the person next to you. What percentage of people do you think stop to help? Just take a second to exchange a number. Okay. Let me have your attention back up front so that we can take a quick temp in the room, whatever room that you are in. How many of you are at the higher end, like 80% or more stopped? Great, I want to live in your world. How many of you at the lower end, 20% or less stopped? Oh, I'm so sorry. By the way, I asked this question in Canada once, and the whole room immediately agreed it was 90%. And I said, oh, no, the study was in the US. Like, 5%. So, if we had more time, it would be interesting to give you a chance to talk to your neighbor about why you have such different expectations of human nature, why you see it so differently. We don't have time for that, so I'm going to tell you the answer. 10% stopped. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about the study, because the students that they used were not just random graduate students. They were seminary students, many of whom were studying to be clergy. And the talk that they were told to go give was on the parable of the Good Samaritan and the importance of helping a stranger in need. Now, why do I tell this inspiring story at the end of our time together? Let me be clear about my intentions. It is not to point a finger and say, oh, look at those hypocritical seminarians. It's instead to acknowledge those seminarians are us. When we take a little time out of our busy lives to reflect on how we're handling some of our most important relationships, you have good advice for yourself. The challenge is when we step back into our busy lives and we're running from point A to point B and we have 43 to-do items on our mind. I wonder how many of those seminarians didn't even see the person because their internal voice is busy planning the talk. They ran a second version of the study where instead of 5 minutes, the talk started in 20 minutes, 50% stopped. There is something about the busyness and distraction of our lives that mean we don't even see the opportunities to walk our own talk, to reach out a hand to help someone else important in our lives to the other side of an important conversation. So as you take a break, as you pick up your email, as you call back to the office, as you text home, I want to invite you, see the opportunity. Take the opportunity. Leadership is about showing someone a better future that we will co-create together. Good luck.